Hello again. With the approach of the 80th anniversary of VE Day, the end of the Second World War in Europe, it is perhaps worth remembering that May the 8th celebrates nothing of the kind. We are so used to thinking of November the 11th as marking the end of the First World War and May the 8th as the end of the Second World War, at least in Europe, that we sometimes forget that these dates signify entirely different events which cannot really be compared. The British government made this clear over the years. For example, in 1946, over a year after VE Day, which took place in 1945, of course, the admission that the war had not ended at all was made for a curious reason that year. In May 1946, there were 373,000 German prisoners of war in this country. A month later, there were 385,000. An increase of 12,000. We were bringing 3,000 German prisoners of war a week into Britain rather than sending them back to Germany. According to Article 75 of the 1929 Geneva Convention on the Rules of War, and we all know how keen the British were about everybody following the Geneva Convention to the letter during the Second World War, the release and repatriation of prisoners of war has to take place as soon as possible after the conclusion of peace. Yet here we were, bringing thousands of prisoners of war here from America, Canada, North Africa, and anywhere else in the world where we could lay hands on them. And rather than repatriating them, we were bringing them to camps here and forcing them to engage in labour. Of course, there was a practical reason for this. We wanted their free labour, especially for agricultural work. If the war had actually ended in May 1945, then the British actions would have constituted a war crime, a flagrant breach of the Geneva Convention's rules of war. The answer was, according to the government of the day, that the war had not really ended, and neither an armistice or peace treaty had been signed. A state of war still existed between Britain and Germany, which meant that we could hold prisoners of war as long as we pleased. We didn't release them all until 1948, by which time we were still technically at war with Germany. So when did the war actually end? The German surrender in May 1945 had been unconditional and no armistice had consequently been signed. There are various ways of bringing a war to an end. The commonest is by means of an armistice, which of course happened at the end of the First World War. This is a legal agreement by various sides in a conflict that they will stop fighting at a certain time, and it usually sets out what will then happen. That's why we celebrate November the 11th, the anniversary of the signing of the document, as Armistice Day, and the nearest Sunday to that being Remembrance Sunday. The 1918 armistice laid out arrangements for ending the fighting and bringing the war to an end. Provisions were also made for the return of prisoners of war to their own countries. In the case of an unconditional surrender, no guarantees are given to a defeated enemy about what will happen next. Everything which follows such a surrender is dependent upon the goodwill of the victor or victors. Because the Second World War was brought to an effective end by this means, the Allies gave no promises or undertakings at all regarding the eventual fate of any prisoners in their hands. Surprisingly, the formal end of World War II and the final arrangement of all outstanding matters was not legally agreed until 1990. Under the terms of the Treaty on the Final Settlement with respect to Germany, Germany finally became a sovereign nation with control over all parts of the country, including Berlin, on the 15th of March 1991. And that is the date on which the Second World War officially ended.